In the summer of 1892, a steelworker named William Foy climbed the iron steps of the converter floor at the Carnegie Steel Plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, just as he had done hundreds of times before. He was a skilled man, experienced, someone the other workers trusted. But that afternoon, something went wrong during the pour, and molten steel at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit erupted outward from the converter vessel. Foy never made it down those steps. His death was recorded in a company ledger, a brief note, no inquiry, no compensation for his family. And by the following Monday, another man had taken his place on that floor. This was not an unusual story inside the Bessemer steel mills of Pittsburgh. It was an ordinary one. For roughly 4 decades, from the 1870s through the early 1900s, the Bessemer converter transformed the United States into the most powerful steel-producing nation on Earth. It made men like Andrew Carnegie spectacularly rich and built the skeleton of modern America, from skyscrapers to railroad tracks. But inside those mills, men were dying at a rate that no industry today would recognize as anything other than a catastrophe. They were dying from explosions, from burns that covered their entire bodies, from falling into ladles of liquid metal, from gases that destroyed their lungs, and from sheer exhaustion after 12-hour shifts 7 days a week in temperatures that could reach the inside of a furnace. The Bessemer converter was one of the most important industrial inventions in American history. It was also, without much debate, the deadliest place a working man in this country could stand. This is the story of why. If you want to understand how the industrial age was actually built and what it cost the people who built it, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a video like this one. To understand why the Bessemer converter killed so many people, you first have to understand what it was and why it mattered so much to the people who owned it. Before Henry Bessemer patented his process in 1856, producing high-quality steel was a painfully slow and expensive operation. Steel was considered a luxury material, used in small quantities for tools, cutlery, and springs. Most large construction still relied on iron, which was cheaper but also weaker and more brittle. Building a railroad bridge out of iron meant building something that could crack under sustained heavy loads. Building it out of steel meant something that could last for generations. The Bessemer process changed that equation almost overnight. The converter itself was a massive pear-shaped vessel, typically around 15 to 20 feet tall, made of iron and lined on the inside with refractory material that could withstand extraordinary heat. It pivoted on a horizontal axis so that it could be tilted to receive molten pig iron and then tilted back upright during the conversion process. The basic idea was elegant, almost shockingly simple for something so violent in practice. Workers would pour several tons of molten pig iron into the tilted vessel. They would then rotate it upright and force blasts of cold air up through small holes in the bottom of the converter, called tuyères. That air would pass through the molten iron at tremendous pressure, and the oxygen in it would react with the carbon and other impurities in the iron, burning them away in a spectacular cascade of fire and sparks. The whole process took somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes, depending on the heat and the quality of the iron. When it worked correctly, you were left with a vessel full of liquid steel, ready to be poured into molds. When something went wrong, you had several tons of molten metal behaving in ways that nobody standing nearby could fully predict or escape. The first Bessemer converter in the United States went into operation in 1864 at a plant in Wyandotte, Michigan. But it was Pittsburgh that became the heart of the American Bessemer industry, largely because of the proximity of coal fields in western Pennsylvania and iron ore that could be shipped down from the Great Lakes. By the 1880s, Pittsburgh and the towns surrounding it along the Monongahela and Ohio rivers were producing more steel than Britain, which had invented the process in the first place. Carnegie Steel, which Andrew Carnegie built into the dominant force in the industry by the early 1890s, operated some of the largest Bessemer plants in the world. His facility at Homestead was considered a wonder of industrial engineering. Carnegie himself described it in those terms, though he rarely visited the mill floor and was famously absent from Pittsburgh during the most violent confrontations between his company and his workers. The mills ran continuously, 24 hours a day, every day of the year except Christmas. There were 2 shifts, and each one lasted 12 hours. The men who worked those shifts were mostly immigrants, a wave of Slavic, Italian, and Eastern European workers who arrived in Pittsburgh in the 1880s and 1890s and found that the mills would hire them even without English. They could learn the job without language. The heat and the noise communicated everything necessary. The most immediate danger inside a Bessemer mill was something that sounds almost too obvious to explain, which is that everything in it was trying to kill you through heat. The temperature inside the converter during the blast could reach between 2,800 and 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit, and while workers were not standing inside the vessel, they were standing close enough that the radiant heat alone could cause serious injury without any direct contact with metal. Steelworkers developed a condition that was common enough to have an informal name among the men themselves, what they called a burning of the eyes, which was essentially the same kind of retinal damage that welders today receive from unprotected arc exposure. After years on the converter floor, many men had significant vision loss. Some went blind before they were 40. The heat inside the mill buildings, even away from the converter itself, was something that visitors who wrote about Pittsburgh in the 1880s and 1890s consistently described in terms of physical shock. The novelist Hamlin Garland visited the mills in 1893 and wrote that the men moved through conditions he could barely endure for a few minutes, working through them for 12 consecutive hours without relief. He described workers soaked completely through their clothing within moments of entering the building, with no real way to cool down or recover until their shift ended. But the radiant heat was almost the manageable part of the danger. The real threat came from the metal itself when it behaved unexpectedly. Molten steel and molten iron are not passive materials. They respond to contaminants, to sudden temperature changes, to moisture in ways that can be explosive rather than merely hot. One of the most persistent dangers inside a Bessemer mill was what workers called a blowout, which occurred when the molten metal inside the converter was pushed through cracks in the refractory lining or forced out through the tuyere holes at the bottom with too much pressure. A blowout could send streams of liquid metal across the converter floor faster than a man could run, covering everything in a spray of material that was the temperature of a small star. The danger from water was particularly severe, and it was responsible for a significant number of the deaths and injuries recorded in Pittsburgh steel mills. Molten metal and water do not interact passively. When even small amounts of water or moisture come into contact with liquid steel, the water flashes instantly to steam and expands to roughly 1,600 times its original volume in fractions of a second. The result is a steam explosion that can throw liquid metal in every direction simultaneously. Workers who survived these explosions typically described them as a sound like a cannon shot, followed immediately by the sensation of fire across whatever part of their body was exposed. The molds into which the steel was poured, called ingot molds, had to be completely dry before they received the metal, and checking them was one of the jobs assigned to younger workers who were new to the mill. If a mold had any residual moisture from cleaning or from condensation on a cold morning, the first pour would detonate. The men who performed these checks and got them wrong did not usually survive to understand what had happened. Beyond the immediate physical dangers, the air inside the Bessemer mill was also a long-term threat to the health of everyone who worked there. The conversion process produced enormous quantities of fumes and fine particles, including iron oxides and silica dust. Workers who spent years on the converter floor frequently developed respiratory conditions that were not well understood at the time, but would later be recognized as forms of what we now call occupational lung disease. Men in their late 30s and 40s who had worked in the mills since their teens commonly experienced what their doctors described as weakness of the lungs, a gradual loss of breathing capacity that progressed whether they left the mills or not. There was no ventilation system in the modern sense in these buildings. The buildings were large enough that some air moved through them, and in summer the heat created convection currents that pulled fumes upward. But in winter, the buildings were often sealed against the cold, and the men breathed whatever the process produced throughout their entire shift. The 12-hour shift itself was a physical danger in ways that went beyond simple fatigue. By hour 10 of a 12-hour shift in that heat, a man's reflexes and judgment were genuinely compromised. He was dehydrated, even if he had been drinking water throughout, because the heat of the environment pulled moisture out of the body faster than most men could reasonably replace it. He was slower, less aware of his surroundings, less able to respond to something unexpected. And yet the converter operated on exactly the same schedule and with the same demands at hour 11 as it did at hour 1. The machine had no knowledge of how tired the man feeding it had become. If you are finding this history as compelling as I do, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below telling me which part of this story surprised you most. There is more ahead, and and what Carnegie's company knew and chose to ignore is even darker than what we have covered so far. The accident records of the Carnegie steel plants in the late 1880s and 1890s represent one of the most striking and under-examined bodies of evidence about industrial labor in American history. They were not secret documents. They were internal company records, and the scale of injury and death they recorded was treated by management as an ordinary cost of doing business. In a single year at the Homestead plant in the early 1890s, according to figures compiled by labor historians who examined these records in the 20th century, more than 25 men were killed in the mill and over 100 sustained injuries serious enough to keep them out of work for extended periods. This was at one facility in 1 year, and it represented a workforce of roughly 3,800 men. By comparison, modern OSHA standards require reporting and investigation of fatalities at a rate that would treat a single year at Homestead as an industry-wide crisis requiring immediate federal intervention. The men who died in these mills had names and families, though the official records often reduced them to a job title and a cause. There were men like József Karinci, a Hungarian immigrant who had been at the Edgar Thomson Works for 3 years when a ladle chain failed and he was buried under a pour of molten steel at age 31. There were men like Thomas Connolly, an Irish-born puddler who survived a severe burn across his right arm in 1886 and returned to work 6 weeks later because there was no compensation system and no income if he did not, and who died of a chest infection 6 months after that, almost certainly worsened by the damage his lungs had sustained over years of mill work. The immigrant experience in the Pittsburgh mills was defined by a particular kind of vulnerability. Men who had come from Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Italy often arrived in Pittsburgh with limited English, limited savings, and a network of family and neighbors who had come from the same village and who were all employed in the same mill. This concentration meant that a single catastrophic accident could devastate an entire community simultaneously. There were incidents at Pittsburgh area mills in which multiple men from the same small town in Eastern Europe were killed or severely injured in the same event, leaving behind a cluster of widows and children with no income and no institutional support. The company did not provide pensions. It did not provide workers' compensation in the modern sense. If a man was killed, his family might receive a small payment from a voluntary relief association, funded partly by worker dues and partly by modest company contributions, but this was not guaranteed and was rarely enough to cover more than a few weeks of living expenses. Widows typically had to find work immediately, and their children often ended the schooling that had brought them to America in the first place. For the men who were injured but not killed, the situation could be almost worse in practical terms. A man who lost fingers or a hand, or who suffered severe burns that left him unable to perform heavy labor, might find himself unable to return to the mill, but also unable to do the kind of light work that existed elsewhere. The disability support available in Pittsburgh in the 1880s and 1890s was essentially nothing beyond private charity. There's a particular account from 1889 that historian Paul Krauss documented in his study of Homestead, involving a man named Michael Sotak, a Slavic worker who had been at the mill for about 4 years when a steam pipe failure in the engine house scalded him severely across his back and shoulders. Sotak survived, but the burns covered enough of his body that he spent nearly 3 months recovering, during which time his family accumulated debt that took years to pay back. When he returned to the mill, he was assigned to a slightly less physically demanding role, which also paid less, and he worked at that reduced wage for the rest of his time at Carnegie Steel. His story was notable not because it was exceptional, but because someone thought to write it down. Most of the men who were injured in the Pittsburgh steel mills in this era left no documented account of what happened to them. They were absorbed back into the workforce if they could be, and they disappeared from the record if they could not. Andrew Carnegie understood in precise numerical terms how many men were dying and being injured in his mills. He was not an ignorant man, and his managers sent him regular reports about production, costs, and what the company referred to internally as labor difficulties, which was a category broad enough to include both union organizing and fatal accidents. Carnegie's public position on the subject of worker safety was consistent with the broader ideology of the Gilded Age industrial class, which was that improvements in safety would come naturally as technology improved, that the market would provide incentives for companies to protect workers. They had invested in training, and the government regulation was both unnecessary and economically harmful. He articulated articulated versions of this argument in his writings, including his famous 1889 essay, The Gospel of Wealth, in which he described the relationship between capital and labor in terms that were deliberately paternalistic and which contained no acknowledgement of the death toll his own facilities were producing. Inside the company, the actual approach to safety was defined less by ideology than by the iron logic of production targets. The Bessemer process required continuous operation to be economically efficient, and stopping production to repair equipment, to improve conditions, or to investigate an accident was a cost that managers were heavily incentivized to minimize. The men who ran the plants at Carnegie Steel knew that their careers depended on meeting production numbers, and the safety improvements that would have reduced deaths often required exactly the kind of production interruptions that threatened those numbers. The refractory lining inside the converter vessel had to be replaced periodically because the intense heat degraded it over time, and cracks in the lining were among the most common causes of blowouts and metal sprays. The schedule on which this lining was replaced was a direct reflection of the tension between safety and production. Replacing it too infrequently meant working with a vessel that had a higher probability of failure. Replacing it on an aggressive schedule meant taking the converter offline for repairs that could last a full day or more. At Carnegie's plants in the 1880s and early 1890s, the evidence suggests that the refractory replacement schedule was often pushed past what experienced workers understood to be safe. There are records of workers, particularly in the skilled trades, who understood the converter mechanics well, refusing specific assignments when they believed the equipment was in a dangerous condition. These refusals were typically treated as disciplinary matters rather than safety concerns. The Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, which was the primary union representing skilled steel workers in Pittsburgh, during this period had made working conditions and safety among its central concerns in contract negotiations with Carnegie Steel through the late 1880s. The union's strength at Homestead in particular was significant enough that it had achieved some modest gains in safety practices and in limiting the speed of the work pace. Carnegie's decision to crush the union at Homestead in 1892, which led to the famous lockout and the violent confrontation between Pinkerton agents and workers that left 10 men dead on the banks of the Monongahela River, was driven by multiple business concerns. But one of its clearest effects in the years that followed was the elimination of the institutional voice that had been pushing back on the pace and conditions inside the mill. After the union was broken at Homestead, the 12-hour shift became universal at the plant. The work pace increased. The accident rate rose in the years immediately following, though the company's internal records became less accessible after the union was no longer there to scrutinize them. The absence of serious regulatory oversight made all of this possible in a way that is hard to fully convey to a contemporary reader. There was no federal occupational safety agency in the 1880s and 1890s. Pennsylvania had enacted some factory inspection legislation, but the inspectors it employed were vastly outnumbered by the facilities they were responsible for monitoring. They had limited authority to compel changes, and they had no power to levy meaningful penalties against a company the size of Carnegie Steel. The legal framework that allowed Carnegie and his counterparts to operate as they did was essentially the legal framework of a society that had not yet decided that workers had a right to come home from their jobs alive. The Bessemer converter began to decline in the United States in the early 20th century, replaced gradually by the open hearth furnace, which produced steel of more consistent quality and allowed for greater control over the chemical composition of the final product. By the 1920s, the Bessemer process had been largely displaced in American steel production, and the last American Bessemer plant stopped operating in the 1960s. The transition away from the Bessemer converter did not bring an immediate revolution in worker safety. The open hearth furnace had its own dangers, and the 12-hour shift persisted in American steel production until 1923, when a sustained public pressure campaign, supported by President Harding and culminating in a famous report by a committee of engineers and economists, shamed the steel industry into adopting an 8-hour shift. The steel companies had resisted this change for decades on the grounds that it was economically unworkable. When they finally made it, they discovered that it was not. The broader story of safety reform in American industry after the Bessemer era was slow, incremental, and driven primarily by external pressure rather than internal corporate recognition. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, which killed 146 garment workers in New York City, most of them young women, galvanized public opinion and accelerated legislative action on factory safety in ways that the accumulated decades of steel mill deaths in Pittsburgh had not. The disparity in those responses says something meaningful about whose deaths were treated as politically significant. The men who built Pittsburgh's steel industry, who worked the converter floors and breathed the fumes and absorbed the burns and sent their earnings home to families in Pennsylvania mill towns and in villages in Eastern Europe, are largely unknown today by name. What they built is still visible. The steel that came out of those converters became railroad bridges, skyscrapers, warships, and the physical infrastructure of a country that grew into the most economically powerful nation in the world in the 20th century. Whether that growth was worth the price those men paid is a question the history books have not always been willing to ask directly, but it is worth asking because the cost was real and it was paid by specific people in specific places in the dark and the heat of a Pittsburgh mill on shifts that never seemed to end. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a documentary like this one. Every week we dig into the corners of history that most people never learned in school and the people who made the modern world but were never written into it the way they deserved. Leave a comment below if you have family history connected to the Pittsburgh mills or to immigrant labor in this era. And if you want to keep watching, the next video is on screen right now.